The air in Baghdad is thick, heavy with the scent of jasmine and the unspoken weight of 1,000 secrets. Seedi-Noumaan was a man of immense wealth and undeniable status in the city. He possessed every luxury a merchant could possibly desire, towering heaps of silk, chests of gold, and a palace of marble, except for a partner to share his vast estate. Then, like a vision from a dream, came Amina. She was breathtakingly beautiful, moving with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly to everyone who beheld her. When Seedi-Noumaan first looked upon her, he felt a sudden, desperate pull in his chest, an overwhelming need to claim her as his own. Their wedding was a grand, legendary affair. The music of lutes and drums echoed through the marble halls of his home for 3 days and 3 nights. But as the celebrations faded and the guests departed, the echoes of the music were replaced by a chilling, hollow silence. It wasn't long before Seedi-Noumaan began to notice the small things, the unsettling habits that didn't quite fit a new bride. At the dinner table, Amina would not touch the succulent roasted lamb he provided. She ignored the mountains of spiced rice and the sweet honeyed dates. Instead, she would take a small, silver toothpick. With the tip of that silver pin, she would pick up a single grain of rice at a time. She would eat one grain, then lapse into silence, followed by another grain and a cold, empty stare that seemed to pierce right through him. He watched her with a growing sense of dread, unable to understand her behavior. He tried to speak to her, offering comfort and asking if she were simply shy or perhaps suffering from some hidden illness. But Amina never answered. She only looked through him as if he were made of glass, her silence growing heavier with every passing day. One night, the moon hung over Baghdad like a curved silver blade. Seedi-Noumaan decided to feign sleep, lying perfectly still and holding his breath. He listened intently to her rhythmic, unnatural breathing as she lay beside him. Suddenly, she rose from the bed. She did not make a single sound. She glided across the floor like a shadow detached from its source. Through narrowed eyes, he watched as she slipped out of the bedchamber and disappeared into the cold, midnight air. A shiver of pure ice raced down his spine. Why would she leave the safety of their home at such an hour? He knew he had to follow her to discover the truth about the woman he had brought into his bed. Little did he know that some truths are better left buried deep in the dirt. The night was suffocating. A heavy black velvet shroud draped over the rooftops of Baghdad. Seedi-Noumaan crept through the shifting shadows of the courtyard, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He kept a careful distance, watching the pale, ghostly figure of Amina as she glided through the city gates with an eerie, weightless grace. She did not look back. She walked with a terrifying, singular purpose that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Seedi-Noumaan felt the cobblestones turn to dust beneath his feet as the familiar city streets gave way to the desolate outskirts of the town. He realized with a jolt of pure horror where the path led, the great cemetery. It was the city of the dead, a place where the living had no business after sunset. The air here was different, thin, cold, and smelling of dry earth mixed with the scent of ancient, stagnant rot. He hid behind a crumbling, weathered tombstone, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He watched, paralyzed by a growing, icy dread, as Amina approached a group of shadowy figures huddled near an open, gaping grave. These figures were not human. They were ghouls, hideous, distorted creatures with skin the color of ash and eyes that burned like dying embers in the dark. Seedi-Noumaan watched in absolute, horrified silence as his wife greeted the monsters. Then the feast began. Seedi-Noumaan felt his stomach churn with a violent, sickening heave that threatened to betray his position. He watched as Amina reached her delicate hands into the freshly turned earth of the grave. She and the ghouls began to tear at the remains of a long-dead corpse with their bare fingers. Amina, the beautiful, elegant woman he had married, was devouring the flesh of the deceased with a ravenous, animalistic hunger. Sound, oh, the sound was something he would never forget. He could hear the wet, tearing noise of the feast echoing through the silent graveyard. He could hear the low, guttural growls of the ghouls as they shared the grisly meal with his wife. Suddenly, the moonlight caught the glint of a silver toothpick, the very same pin she used to pick at single grains of rice during their dinners at home. Seedi-Noumaan realized the terrible truth. She was not shy and she was not ill. She was simply saving her appetite for the dead. A scream began to build in his throat, a primal cry of revulsion. He clamped his hand over his mouth to stay silent, knowing that if the ghouls spotted him, or if Amina looked up and saw her husband watching, he would never leave that graveyard alive. He turned and fled into the darkness, stumbling over rocks and roots until the horrifying sights and sounds were far behind him. But the image was burned into his mind forever. The woman he loved was a monster. The dawn broke over Baghdad like a bruised pomegranate, streaking the sky with deep, angry purples and sickly oranges. Seedi-Noumaan sat at the breakfast table, his body rigid and his heart heavy as lead. He felt the hard wood of the chair pressing into his back, solid and real, yet the world around him felt like a fragmented nightmare. He watched the door with unblinking intensity, waiting for the monster to appear. Then Amina entered the room. She looked radiant, showing no trace of the filth or the darkness from the night before. She wore a silk robe the color of cream and sat across from Seedi-Noumaan with a terrifying, serene smile. As she had done so many times before, she reached for the silver toothpick and began to pick once again at a single grain of rice. Seedi-Noumaan felt a surge of hot, bubbling rage erupt within his chest. He could still smell the cloying rot of the graveyard clinging to his senses. He could still hear the wet, tearing sounds of the ghouls echoing in his ears. "Amina," he whispered, his voice was trembling, shaking like a lonely leaf in a gale. "Amina, are the graves of Baghdad not enough to satisfy your hunger?" The room went deathly silent. Amina froze, the silver toothpick stayed suspended in the air midway to her lips. Her eyes, usually soft and alluring, turned into cold, black pits of obsidian. She did not blink, she did not deny the accusation. Instead, a low, vibrating hiss escaped her throat. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward in a frantic haste to get away. "Amina is a demon, she is a ghoul," he shouted, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. Amina stood up slowly, very slowly. She seemed to grow taller, whiter, as the shadows in the room gathered around her body like a dark shroud. She reached for a vessel of water sitting upon the table. Seedi-Noumaan tried to run for the exit, but his legs felt like leaden weights. He watched, paralyzed, as she dipped her fingers into the water and flicked the cold droplets directly into his face. "Wretch," she shrieked, "Seedi-Noumaan wants to see the truth, then he shall see the world as a beast." A searing, white-hot pain exploded behind his eyes, and he fell to the floor in agony. He felt his bones snapping, shifting, shrinking, coarse hair sprouted from every pore of his skin. He tried to scream for help, but only a sharp, pathetic yelp escaped his throat. Amina looked down and sneered at the creature trembling at her feet. Seedi-Noumaan was gone. In his place lay a mangy, terrified stray dog. Her laughter echoed through the house like the tolling of a funeral bell. The world had grown, massive, terrifying. Seedi-Noumaan looked up from the cold marble floor, but his eyes were no longer the eyes of a man. The ceiling of the palace seemed miles away. The legs of the table looked like giant wooden pillars. Seedi-Noumaan tried to speak, he tried to cry out for mercy, but his throat only produced a wet, pathetic whimper. He was a dog, a lowly, shivering stray. Above the head of Seedi-Noumaan, the shadow of Amina loomed like a thundercloud. She looked down with a face of pure, distilled malice. Amina reached for a heavy, iron-tipped cane leaning against the wall. "Get out," she shrieked. Amina swung the cane with a violent, whistling force. The iron struck the ribs of Seedi-Noumaan. Pain, blinding, white-hot pain, exploded through his small, furry body. He scrambled across the tiles. The claws of Seedi-Noumaan clicked and slid on the polished stone. He yelped, a sound of pure agony, as Amina struck again. "Vile beast," she spat. Amina chased him through the hallways of the house. She showed no mercy. Seedi-Noumaan saw the servants, the men and women he had once paid, watching from the corners. But the servants did not see their master. They only saw a mangy, flea-bitten cur being beaten by the mistress of the house. Seedi-Noumaan reached the heavy, arched doorway of the courtyard. Amina delivered one final, crushing blow to his flank. He tumbled down the stone steps. Seedi-Noumaan rolled into the dusty street outside the gates. Amina stood at the threshold. She looked down at the broken animal that used to be a husband. Amina slammed the heavy wooden doors shut. The sound echoed like a tomb closing. Boom, Seedi-Noumaan lay in the dirt. He was alone, he was hungry. Seedi-Noumaan was a ghost in his own city. A group of street children spotted him. They began to gather stones. Seedi-Noumaan saw the first rock fly through the air. He turned and limped into the dark, narrow alleys. He had lost his home. Seedi-Noumaan had lost his humanity. The hunt had truly begun. The sun was a searing, golden furnace. Seedi-Noumaan limped through the labyrinth of Baghdad, feeling the scorching heat of the cobblestones against the pads of his paws. The thirst, the agonizing thirst, was a fire in his throat. Every shadow held a new terror. Seedi-Noumaan passed the Grand Bazaar, where the rich, aromatic scents of roasting meats and spiced stews were a torture to his heightened senses. He approached a butcher's stall and looked up with pleading, liquid eyes. Seedi-Noumaan wagged his tail, a desperate, pathetic gesture of human supplication. But the butcher did not see the merchant. He only saw a filthy, mangy cur. "Away, begone, you flea-bitten wretch," the butcher roared, swinging a heavy wooden cleaver handle. Seedi-Noumaan yelped and ducked as the wood whistled just inches above his head. He scrambled into the gutter, feeling the filth of the city staining his matted fur. He reached a stagnant puddle of water and began to lap at the liquid. It was bitter, tasting of dust and waste, but he drank greedily. Seedi-Noumaan had no choice. He was a creature of the earth now. Suddenly, a pack of feral dogs emerged from the mouth of a dark alleyway. These were the true kings of the streets, led by a massive, scarred beast with a torn ear. The pack leader bared yellowed fangs at him. Seedi-Noumaan felt a primal, ancient fear strike his heart. He did not know how to fight like an animal, nor did he know the language of snarls and bites. He tried to retreat, but the pack surrounded him. The pack leader lunged, and Seedi-Noumaan felt teeth sink into his neck. He thrashed and rolled in the dirt, fighting with the desperation of a man who refused to die as a dog. He managed to break free, tearing away with a frantic, limping run. Seedi-Noumaan hid beneath a broken vegetable cart and licked the blood from his shoulder. His dignity was gone, and his wealth was a distant, fading dream. He looked at the moon rising over the city and wondered if he would ever hear a human voice speak his name again. The night was cold. Seedi-Noumaan curled into a tight ball, shivering as the sounds of the city hummed around him. He closed his eyes and prayed for a miracle. The baker was a man of large proportions and a soft, rounded face. Seedi-Noumaan watched from the shadows as the man pulled a tray of golden, steaming flatbread from the oven. He felt the hunger in his belly roar like a lion, yet Seedi-Noumaan did not bark or growl. Instead, he sat perfectly upright at the edge of the shop. Seedi-Noumaan looked at the baker and tilted his head, expressing a silent, dignified plea for mercy. The baker paused. He looked down at the scrawny, matted dog sitting so politely on the cobblestones. He expected the dog to snatch a loaf and run, or perhaps scavenge in the waste bins, but Seedi-Noumaan remained still. He looked the baker directly in the eyes with a gaze that was hauntingly human. "Well now," the baker muttered, wiping his flour-dusted hands on a stained apron, "you are a strange one, aren't you?" The baker reached out with a small piece of broken bread. Seedi-Noumaan did not lunge. He stepped forward slowly and took the bread from the fingers of the baker with the gentlest of touches. Seedi-Noumaan then bowed his head, lowering his ears in a gesture of profound gratitude. The baker gasped, having never seen a beast with such manners. "Stay then, little friend," the baker whispered, patting a soft, burlap sack in the corner of the warm shop. Seedi-Noumaan understood. He trotted to the sack and curled up near the heat of the oven. For the first time since the curse of Amina, Seedi-Noumaan felt a glimmer of safety. Days turned into weeks. Seedi-Noumaan became the baker's constant companion, showing 1,000 signs of intelligence. He would fetch the baker's slippers and guard the coins on the counter with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. Customers began to flock to the shop just to see the scholar dog. They whispered that the soul of a poet lived inside the fur of Seedi-Noumaan. But Seedi-Noumaan was not a scholar. He was a man in a cage of flesh and bone. He watched the passing crowds, hoping, praying, that someone would see the truth beneath the fur. One afternoon, a woman entered the shop. She had eyes that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. The bell above the baker's door chimed, a thin, silver sound that cut through the heavy heat of the afternoon. Seedi-Noumaan looked up from the burlap sack. Standing in the doorway was a young woman with a presence that felt older than her years. She wore a veil of deep indigo silk, and her eyes were not like the eyes of the other customers. They did not look at a dog with curiosity. They did not see an animal at all. The daughter stepped into the shop, ignoring the golden loaves of bread and the baker's friendly greeting. She walked directly toward Seedi-Noumaan. As she approached, a strange, tingling sensation raced through his fur. The air seemed to grow thick with the smell of ozone and dried herbs. Seedi-Noumaan stood up, wagging his tail instinctively, but then he stopped. He sensed that she knew. The daughter knelt in the flour-dusted straw and reached out a slender hand to touch his forehead. "Father," she called out to the baker, her voice ringing clear like a bell in the small shop. "Why do you keep a man chained in the body of a beast?" The baker laughed nervously, wiping his hands on his apron as if to scrub away the sudden tension. "A man? No, my daughter, that is only my clever little friend. That is the scholar dog of Baghdad." The daughter shook her head, never breaking eye contact with Seedi-Noumaan. "No, father, this is no animal. This is Seedi-Noumaan. This is a man of wealth and status, bound by a dark graveyard curse." Seedi-Noumaan felt a surge of hope so violent it nearly stopped his heart. He let out a sharp, urgent bark and nuzzled the hand of the daughter. He whined, a long, melodic sound that carried all the grief of his lost life. The baker gasped, dropping a tray of rolls that hit the floor with a clatter. He looked at Seedi-Noumaan with newfound terror and wonder. "Is it true? Is this poor creature a human soul?" The daughter stood up, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective light. "The woman Amina has done this. She is a creature of the dark who has stolen his life and left him to rot in the gutters." Seedi-Noumaan stood on his hind legs, placing his paws on her waist. He looked up at her, begging, pleading for the nightmare to finally end. "Do not fear, Seedi-Noumaan," the daughter whispered, stroking his matted ears. "The magic of Amina is strong, but the light of truth is stronger. You shall walk as a man once more." The daughter turned back to her father with an expression of iron resolve. "Bring me a bowl of clear, cold water. Bring me the salt of the earth. The ritual must begin before the moon rises." The daughter of the sorceress moved with a sudden, sharp intensity. She placed a copper bowl on the floor in front of Seedi-Noumaan. The water inside the bowl was perfectly still, a dark, shimmering mirror reflecting the flickering candlelight. The daughter reached into a silken pouch at her waist and pulled out a handful of shimmering, crystalline salt. "Watch closely, Seedi-Noumaan," the daughter commanded. Seedi-Noumaan leaned forward and peered into the depths of the copper bowl. The daughter began to chant. The words were ancient. The words sounded like the rushing of a hidden river or the rustling of desert sands. Seedi-Noumaan watched as she sprinkled the salt into the water. Sizzle, the water did not splash. Instead, it began to boil and churn despite there being no fire beneath the bowl. A pale, violet light began to radiate from the vessel. The light filled the room, casting long, dancing shadows against the bags of flour. The daughter reached out and cupped the glowing water in her palms. She looked at Seedi-Noumaan with a gaze of absolute iron. "If Amina cast you down, then let the salt of the earth raise you up," the daughter cried out. She flung the enchanted water directly onto the head of Seedi-Noumaan. Crack! The sound was like a lightning strike inside the small room. Seedi-Noumaan felt a sensation of immense, crushing weight being lifted. He felt his spine lengthen. He felt his skull shift and expand with a terrifying, wet grinding noise. The fur, the coarse, matted hair of the beast, began to recede into his skin like mist vanishing in the sun. Seedi-Noumaan screamed, but the sound was no longer a yelp. It was the deep, resonant cry of a human man. He fell forward and felt the cold stone against his human palms. Seedi-Noumaan looked at his hands, his fingers, his skin. He was no longer a dog. He was a man once more. Seedi-Noumaan gasped for air, the oxygen tasting sweeter than any bread the baker had ever baked. The baker fell to his knees in shock. The daughter stepped back, wiping the sweat from her brow. Seedi-Noumaan stood up, feeling shaky and wobbly as if he were learning to walk for the first time. He looked at the daughter and tried to find the words to thank her for saving his soul. "Justice, Seedi-Noumaan," the daughter whispered. "Do not thank me yet. Amina still sits in your palace. She still hunts in the night. Go now, seek the caliph, take back the life that she stole." Seedi-Noumaan tightened his jaw. His eyes burned with a cold, righteous fury. The dog was gone, and the merchant of Baghdad had returned. "I must speak with the caliph," he demanded. The guards laughed and crossed their spears, but Seedi-Noumaan did not flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a signet ring, the ring he had hidden in the baker's shop, and the crest of Seedi-Noumaan glittered in the light. The gates groaned open. Seedi-Noumaan walked through the hall of pillars until he finally stood before the great caliph, who sat upon a throne of ivory and silk. He fell to his knees and told the harrowing tale of the silver toothpick, the graveyard feast, and the water that had turned a man into a dog. The caliph leaned forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "This is a story of madness, Seedi-Noumaan," the caliph whispered. "If you speak the truth, then a demon dwells within the walls of this city." The caliph summoned the royal guard and the daughter of the sorceress. Together, they marched toward the house of Seedi-Noumaan. The doors burst open to reveal Amina sitting in the garden, lounging by the fountain and sipping tea as if she had not a single care in the world. She looked up and saw the caliph, but when her eyes fell upon Seedi-Noumaan, her face turned a sickly, pale gray. She tried to reach for the vessel of water on the table to flick droplets at the guards, but Seedi-Noumaan was faster. He lunged forward and seized her hand before she could cast the curse. "The game is over, Amina," he roared. The daughter of the sorceress stepped forward, holding a vial of dark, swirling liquid. "The law of the desert is clear," the daughter proclaimed. "The shapeshifter shall be bound by the form of her own malice." The caliph watched in grim silence as Seedi-Noumaan held her still. The daughter threw the liquid upon the face of Amina. She did not scream like a woman. She shrieked like a hawk as her body began to twist and shrink. Her silk robes fell empty to the grass, and out of the heap of fabric a white mare emerged, a beautiful horse, but one with eyes of pure, burning hatred. Seedi-Noumaan looked at the mare and knew his journey was not yet over. The garden was silent, save for the frantic, heavy breathing of the white mare. Seedi-Noumaan stood over the beast that had once been his wife. The white mare, who was once the treacherous Amina, lashed out with a hoof, striking the stone fountain with a sharp, ringing crack that echoed through the courtyard. The caliph stepped forward, looking at the creature with eyes of cold stone. "Seedi-Noumaan," the caliph spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of judgment. This creature, this Amina, has forfeited the right to walk as a human. She sought to make you a slave to the streets. Now she shall be a slave to the saddle. Seedi-Noumaan felt no joy, only a hollow, aching weariness. He walked to the stables and returned with a bridle of heavy leather and a whip of braided hemp. The white mare reared up, bearing long, white teeth at her former husband. But the daughter of the sorceress stepped forward and whispered a word of binding. The white mare froze, standing trembling and foaming at the mouth, as Seedi-Noumaan forced the iron bit between her teeth. "This is the penance of Amina," Seedi-Noumaan declared, his voice low, steady, and filled with a grim finality. "Every day, I shall lead the white mare through the city. Every day, she shall carry the burdens that I once carried alone in the dirt." The Caliph shadowed this decree with a nod of approval before departing, leaving Seedi-Noumaan alone with the monster in the skin of a horse. Years passed in Baghdad. The people began to recognize the tall, somber merchant and his beautiful yet temperamental white horse. They watched as Seedi-Noumaan led her to the market, feeding her only enough to survive. Whenever the white mare showed a flash of her old, ghoulish malice, Seedi-Noumaan would raise the whip. Whack! The sound was a reminder of the graveyard, the silver toothpick, and the night he spent shivering under a vegetable cart. Seedi-Noumaan never married again. He lived a quiet life of charity and prayer, giving much of his wealth to the baker who had shown him mercy, and ensuring the daughter of the sorceress was honored in the palace. But every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he would look into the eyes of the white mare. He would see the flickering, hateful soul of Amina trapped behind that animal gaze. He would remember that beauty is often a mask, and that the darkest ghouls are those who sit at our own dinner tables. Seedi-Noumaan had his life back, but he would never truly forget the taste of the gutter or the chill of the midnight ritual.